Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dear viewers, Assalamu alaikum. I'm your host Faisal Raza and you are watching Foresight. Viewers, after United Nations General Assembly 63rd session, intergovernmental negotiations started back in 2008-2009 to have reforms in the United Nations Security Council. Reforms that are more democratic, fair, equitable, accountable and based on regional representation. But after 15 years of negotiation, still overall it revolves around whether to add new permanent members or not, with or without veto power, or whether long-term elected non-permanent members and how many. So there are lots of questions which are still existing. There are lots of proposals which are circulating. Individual states, groups, regions and international organizations all in quest. It looks more a power politics, rather striving for intended United Nations Security Council reforms. It's another very harsh fact that unfortunately over the years, United Nations Security Council was manipulated. It becomes tool to power politics, failed to implement its own resolutions, decisions and to achieve the long-term peace and stability and security across the globe. This was actually the essence of the UN Charter. United Nations Security Council reforms are that's why inevitable for its efficient working and to regain its lost reputation. To talk on this very important subject, we have in our studios Dr. Noor Fatima. She is the political economist. Most welcome to you, Dr. Fatima. Thank you very much. And with her, Ambassador Jauhar Saleem. He is the seasoned diplomat and President of Institute of Regional Studies, IRS. Most welcome to you, sir. Thank you very much for your time. And online joining us, Maham Nawaeed. She is international law expert. Most welcome to you, Maham. Thank you very much for your time as well. So my question to you, Maham, at first that how much support sought by the United Nations General Assembly's decision 62/557 on September 15th, 2008 to hold intergovernmental negotiations on Security Council reforms in a comprehensive and membership-based or a membership-driven nature?
Assalamu alaikum ji, and thank you for having me. So, the Security Council reforms has been on the agenda of the United Nations for quite some time now, with the first set of reforms actually that have happened in 1965. When we talk about the reforms that were tabled in 2008 and we talk about the support at the Foresight, a lot of support. So it was recognized at that time by even the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council that the geopolitical realities of the world were constantly evolving and changing, and so they were not the same as they were at the time that the United Nations were created. And so the Security Council had to evolve in line with those realities. And when we talk about an evolution of the Security Council, what came into being at that time was an intergovernmental negotiation forum that the General Assembly created. In the entire international community and all members of the General Assembly backed it. And as a result of it, what was created were 8 different country groups that came into being. The way that the 8 groups were created were that different groups had different mandates and different ideas about the reform and what the reforms should entail. So I would mostly be talking about the Uniting for Consensus group, for which Pakistan is a part of. But then we had the African Union group, we had the G4, which India is a part of, which is advocating for permanent seats at the UN. There's the Arab group, there is the Caribbean group, then there is the developing country group. And so there were multiple groups that came into being.
Definitely, you
But
are absolutely right. The African Union and all others, even the P5 has its own position. So your point well taken. Ambassador Saleem said whether this intergovernmental negotiations for the UNSC reforms started back in 2008, 2009, stand still or moving forward, because we have seen that it looks more a power struggle than restructuring for an effective council. That is very important.
Ji. This negotiation, which we call IGN, it is moving at a snail's pace. And the basic reason is the different perceptions that different countries have. And the perceptions are based naturally on their interests. And these groups that came into being, which was mentioned by your commentator, it's true. Because different countries had shared commonalities of perception, they had shared interests, and because of that reason, these groups came into being. Pakistan and Italy and many other countries, they're together in this UFC, Uniting for Consensus, which was earlier, it originally came into being as the Coffee Club, and then it changed to UFC, and the membership largened to a great extent. So what is happening is that, look, on the one side, there was the reality of the Second World War. The victors, they all became the permanent members, and they had the veto powers. And then other countries, they're the non-permanent members, 10 of them which are elected. Now that structure lasted for quite some time. But then we know the global realities have changed. New powers have emerged. And in fact, even to begin with, that was an unfair sort of dispensation. So there has been a lot of pressure that there's a need to reform the UN to reflect the current realities, as well as to make it more functional, more effective, more productive. Now for that, you have to reform both the UNGA as well as the UNSC. But what we have seen in these negotiations so far is that there's a lot of emphasis on the reform of UNSC, more than the reform of UNGA, which is important, equally important in my view. And why is that? Because the power in some ways lies there. Because UNSC can actually have binding resolutions, and those resolutions, then have to be followed, or the consequences. Although we have seen in some cases they're not, there's no clarity, or at least there's some ambivalence as to a particular resolution is binding or non-binding. In a recent case, where there was a resolution on Gaza, and Israel refused to implement it, saying that it was non-binding.
Unfortunately, it's a perpetual thing that the UN Security Council passed a resolution and then afterwards fail to implement that in the letter of spirit.
Yeah, because
so
of
it is unfortunate.
Yeah, because of the technicalities as well. Sometimes they say under which chapter is it chapter 7, or which chapter the resolution is under, and because then they can have different force of application. But regardless of that, the point is, now what do we see in these groups? G4, what do they want? They want to all become permanent members, new permanent members. Brazil, India, Germany, Japan. Okay, and their claim is that, they are the emerging economic powers, they have big populations, and within their regions, they have a preeminent position. But UFC, is against that. And why? UFC says that, already there's an injustice within the UN system, that there's a club of privileged, who don't have to get elected, they are permanently there. P5. And then they have the veto power is the P5. And this veto power is inherently like a flawed concept, because, in so many cases we see that, this veto power, brings a situation to a standstill, and the UN becomes ineffective. So UFC is against that. Now African Union, what do they want? African Union, it's a union of 55 countries. They say that, we have 55 countries, so if you want to add more members, we need to have 2 more permanent members and 3 to 5 non-permanent members additional. So that is their stance. But now that the new blocks, for instance, OIC, OIC
yeah, definitely.
We'll
we'll talk later on those aspects as well. Your point well taken, Mr. Ambassador. Dr. Noor Fatima, what do you think that under UN Charter, reform agenda must have to be based on regional representation? Its effectiveness, It must have to be equitable, accountable, legitimacy must have to be there, fairness and more democratic, based on democratic values. So rather on power politics, which actually deteriorated the stature and the structure of the Security Council overall. So how do you respond to this one?
Yes, you are very right. Actually, you see, this UFC is the product which we see in this reform kind of whole process since 2007-8.
Uniting for consensus.
Yes, this is the only outcome we see as a ray of hope now, because what they are up to is that we need to have accountability. We need to have a kind of containment of a veto power, as Ambassador Sabah said already, because it's very difficult for you to get 2/3 majority on any of the international issues, particularly the conflicts, because it's Security Council, right? And if at all there is a possibility, for instance, we had for that, for Pakistan and India issue, it can be vetoed very easily, very comfortably. So basically what is there is a sabotaging whole of the system of the decision making and the accountability if the same system is working. So rather working on a power structure, if it works on inclusiveness of the geographical inclusiveness, as he talked about very rightly about African region, and the rest of the developing countries, for instance Latin America, for instance Asia, they cannot be part of the permanent member, non-permanent member can be there, that can be expanded for the sake of their being as a stakeholder and being a part of the decision making.
Definitely, most of the, unfortunately, most of the regions are vulnerable as well as ill represented. So it is unfortunate. Ambassador Jauhar, Saleem sir, what are the G4 key demands? Because we know that they want to have the permanent membership along with the veto power, but even the P5 is a bit reluctant on that. So what's their vision of permanent category, basically, with or without veto power? How they justify their bid and qualification?
Basically what they claim is that they are the preeminent countries within their sort of respective regions, number one. Number two, they're saying that economically they are like one of the largest economies in the some of the largest economies in the world. But the problem with their position is that, okay, if you have new members like that, then we are actually even expanding the problem, because the problem lies in that veto power and the club of the privileged. So that is the inherent problem in their argument. Now the other thing is, for instance, because when it comes to veto power, and when they witness that a lot of groups, other countries and groups are not very keen to give the new members the additional, if any are agreed, veto power, then they try to come up with a slightly more nuanced position. And what was that? They said, okay, initially we would not have a veto power, so first let's expand that, and subsequently we would see whether the veto power has to be given or not. So now this is a tricky position, because once you agree to the first, then of course they're already in the privileged position, and then of course they can manipulate the veto power as well. And that is why UFC has been saying that no, this cannot be done, because and this is a basic
and that's not going to be fair, really.
Exactly, and that is a basic tenet of international agreements as well, that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And on that premise, when you work on that premise, then you have to take into account what other groups want, and if you want a fairer dispensation, it's not about just power then, because these, apparently the G4 group is just trying to get more powerful, like basically by becoming P5 members, and because that will add to their national power and their international clout. But that would be at the expense of other countries then, and that would not be fair. That's why African Union, and they tried then to basically, enlist the support of African Union by, like giving them, offering them what they wanted, or at least in a diluted form. But UFC also is in deliberations with the African Union, with the other groups, and I think, and that is why you see this deadlock, because of this excessive demand by this G4 group. And we have to see something very interesting here. Look, Germany is a member of G4, but Italy which is a neighboring country,
Yeah.
a fellow EU member. It's part of UFC, and in fact, one of the leading countries in the UFC. And there's so many other countries like that. So the fact is that I think eventually, whatever has to be agreed, everybody would have to make some concession naturally. But I don't see a possibility where all the countries would agree to just enhancing this club of the privileged. I think it will have to be a much more fairer.
Initially, it is said that when Italy-Colombia paper first came, actually, and then it was basically in reaction to the G4. Some of the countries came into UFC just because of the reaction to G4, but later UFC taken a position which is quite understandable to the world as well. So your point well taken, Mr. Ambassador. Dr. Noor, do you think that adding more permanent members into the UNSC, it is going to imbalance the council, as well as whether G4 addressed the concerns of the other nations as well? Because this is not simply to give the permanent membership or to veto, because lots of countries, lot of nations, lot of states has the stakes. So especially when it comes to the UFC, because UFC is actually addressing the concerns of others, but we haven't seen G4 addressing the concerns of others. So how do you see that?
I think expanding the permanent membership in UNSC would be more, I would say, taking decision or taking accountability towards the worse, because that is the point of UFC. Because then there is no accountability, and of course it's not even accountability, it's no implementation of the decision which you take even out of like 2/3 majority.
Obviously.
And they are there to actually veto it, and even they are not allowing these G4 to bring more non-permanent member. Even they don't allow us, allow UN to actually expand it to that extent, because in any case they will be part of that accountability, and they don't want to be accountable.
This is
That is the
unfortunate
point.
at
That
the
is
part
the
of
point.
G4
That is the
particularly
point,
when
yeah.
they are talking about. So Maham, what it means when Pakistan emphasize on more democratic, effective, credible mechanism of for the maintenance of international peace and security through comprehensive and consensus-based reforms of the Security Council. What it means actually?
So, the idea behind reforming the Security Council has always been to broaden the representation and to make it more efficient and, most importantly, transparent. Especially because the criticism is that the Security Council is too exclusive. So, when Pakistan says comprehensive and consensus based, Pakistan believes that the Security Council should reflect the interest of the wider UN membership, and that decisions that impact the larger international community should also be taken by democratically elected states that are also equal on a sovereign level. And so that is why the Pakistan backs the Uniting for Consensus proposal, which has now forward the suggestion that there need to be no new permanent seats, but 11 more non-permanent seats, 9 of which should be for a longer term basis, so that that gives the some countries room to have more of a say in the decision making process of the Security Council. So the 9 new long term seats would be ranging between 3 to 5 years, and have 2 additional 2-year seats which would be allocated to Eastern Europe and small developing islands and smaller countries. And this proposal was made after a lot of back and forth between the UFC countries, and Pakistan believes it has the necessary flexibility and encompasses enough of the democratic representation to accommodate the interests of a number of states. In addition to that, as Ambassador Saab has also spoken about, the Uniting for Consensus proposal can also tie in with some of the broader outlines of the proposal of the African Union, which talks about a broader representation of more people in the Security Council, but not necessarily yielding uh, extra or privileged, unjustifiable power over those who hold positions over them. So that is why Pakistan inherently is against having additional countries with permanent seats and is not backing the G4 proposal to it.
Definitely, your point well taken. Dr. Noor, Fatima, when we are talking about particularly the proposals as Maham is talking about, so UNFC, including Pakistan, have already proposed at least 12 new long-term, non-permanent but elected members.
Yeah.
Elected members.
Exactly.
They might be, there is a discussion going on that might be the rotation after 2 years, which is still there into the Security Council. That might be doubled or might be elongated, but they have to come through election process. So to turn that whole council more representative and democratic in its decision making, that's what Maham is actually saying. So that makes the council more effective. How do you see that particularly, and what particularly about the proposal of the UFC?
UFC. The one of the most important feature which I think will work in future is the rotational representation. You know, what Pakistan says and what UFC says is that there should be no permanent member. The member should come, have their rotation time, have their time, then it should be rotated on the basis of democratic values, as we see in this world, and that's why United Nations is there. And then the next country should take over. That next member should come, and then it should be working like an inclusive, on the basis of inclusive, on the basis of geographical distribution, on the basis of equity also. So now it looked like a total lopsided development of the judgments, as well as the implementation, as well as the veto powers. So all this coffee group, what in the beginning it was a coffee group.
Yeah, it
says,
of course, yes.
It says that we should have a look like a democratic values in it, accountability in it, decision making more inclusively in it, and then geographical distribution in it. I think this is a very rational thing which this UFC group is putting forward it. So rotational thing, I think that will work in my view with, I think, if they allow the non-permanent member more expansion.
You're right, you're right. Ambassador Jauhar, Saleem sir, under the Esselvini consensus of 2005, African countries demanded 2 permanent seats with the veto power and 3 non-permanent seats. They have already 3 regarding the region. So whether UFC, including Pakistan, supports their demand as a whole, or only the non-permanent candidature? What's the basis of the, if Pakistan or UFC supports them in permanent nature as well, so what's the basis of that?
Yeah, that was interesting. This consensus, which was reached in 2005, the Zulvini consensus, because of the place where it took place, that meeting. Yeah, they demanded 2 permanent memberships, of the UNSC, and 5 non-permanent. At some point, because that's a powerful group, 55 countries. So at some point, the G4 tried to sort of, enlist their support by offering them to accept their demand. And they came up with a new proposal which incorporated their demand for 2 seats as well. So then instead of 4 new members, they wanted 6 new members with 2 Africans. At that point, UFC, because realizing that, there was this kind of, in a way, it's sort of, they're trying to maneuver something which would not be very fair. So the UFC revised its position as well, because the original position was that no new permanent members. I think UFC never said that, okay, everything should be abolished, because the reality, whatever is there is there. But beyond that, they said no new members, no new permanent members. Rather have more sort of, and you already have like 10 of those electable members. So they wanted more electable members and for longer terms. But in view of this, the African Union's position, what they said was that, okay, we agree that we'll make a special exception for, for Africa, because Africa deserves, it's a huge continent and there are 55 countries and sort of, because of those reasons.
Is it because one of the reasons, Mr. Ambassador, that might be G4 is talking about individual permanent membership, and African Union wants a regional approach.
Yeah.
So would that be a point as well?
Actually, G4 was also talking about, because in the nuanced position, they were also talking about regional, enhancing regional representation. But what they said was, okay, 2 members from Asia and Pacific, 2 from Africa, 1 from Latin America. They justified their claim through, through a new proposal, which was supposedly based on regional representation. But then UFC had to sort of, review its position as well, because otherwise, they could have been, because you see, these are like in international relations, you have these, in some ways, these are like game theory playing in practice.
Yeah, definitely.
So you have to be careful as well.
That.
So then, and also, recognizing the fact that the African Union, they had a point, like Africa is a big continent and they deserve that representation. So then UFC said, okay, for Africa, we make an exception, fine. In sort of, and this is very recent as well. Ambassador Munir Akram has made a statement in this regard as well, that, maintaining their position that no new centers of privilege. UFC said that we will accept 2 more members, we can accept 2 more members from Africa, and we also accept in principle the point that those members would be decided by the African Union itself, because that was also part of the Zulwani.
Definitely, that's the very important point, Mr. Ambassador. Dr. Noor, African Union has not yet specified its candidates for the permanent membership. So while they are having somewhat a different approach than G4 and the group of 4, so some resemblance it looks at, as Mr. Ambassador Munir Akram rightly said, with uniting for consensus as well. So, but not as a whole. So how would you see that how African Union dealt with this issue?
They will deal with this issue.
Yeah, how they are dealing actually,
Yes.
because they are not never specified the candidate for the 2 seats.
There is a challenge. A challenge is from, of course, the permanent members itself. Challenge is, of course, from the G5, P5 or
P5
and G4
Yes.
itself, because it's challenging the status quo in a way. So
it
it
looks
is
like
the
that,
challenging
yeah.
of status quo, of course, and it is a challenge of a coordination between the all. This I see the 2 main issue in the challenge in the future. If UFC and African situation is up to that roadmap, so that I see the challenge, that challenging the status quo and as well as the coordination.
So, Mr. Ambassador, how do you see the, you were earlier mentioning about the Organization of Islamic Conference, Cooperation, demand its representation in the UN Security Council, and Pakistan made it very clear that no reform will be acceptable without the adequate representation of the Muslim Ummah. So, when it comes to OIC represents different continents, from Asia, from Africa, from GCC, from Middle East, lots of other regions. So, African Union demanding seats for its own, representation for its region, but it's an organization, 57 countries, largest after United Nations, no doubt about that.
Yeah.
But how that representation would be?
Well, OIC, first of all, like you said yourself, African Union has 55 members.
Yeah.
OIC has 57 members. It's actually bigger than African Union in that way. The second point is Muslims across the world. This is the 2nd largest faith now, but it's projected to be the largest faith in the coming decades, this century. And in this whole configuration of what is happening, there's going to be no Muslim country. Nobody is sort of, like putting up a Muslim country as a candidate for, let's say, if there are some new permanent members. So there was no Muslim country as such on the anvil for that. So that is why I think seeing that what others were doing, because and these groups had been very effective, particularly the African Union and the others as well, UFC or G4 and sort of, and the Latin American countries
because
themselves.
rest of the representation, what they are demanding actually, whether it's permanent or non-permanent, they are demanding from the regions.
Yeah.
But this is based upon religion.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm coming to that. So basically, you see, countries can get together on regional basis sometimes, but then on other bases as well, on ideological basis. For instance, you had this communism and sort of, there was.
Yeah, definitely. You are right. You are right.
And like there are a lot of people who say EU is a Christian club, and even some of the EU leaders have said that because of the EU is not just about, it's not a regional bloc only, it's about a cultural bloc, and that is why perhaps Turkey has not been taken in. Although Turkey had been a candidate long before many countries who were taken in the European Union. So I think so the Muslim countries, they've put forth their demand based on the fact that because they have these shared values, they have these shared interests, they have a lot of commonalities, and but just the fact because they are dispersed, it shouldn't mean that they should be denied just on that basis.
Definitely, your point well taken, Mr. Ambassador. Maham, it seems that the West, especially some of the permanent members, are actually supporting the group of four, and behind the curtain, or might be in front of everyone. So, what's your take on that? Where France, Britain, and United States stand right now, and what's the position of China and Russia on UNSC reforms?
So the United States has now said that it's open to the UNSC reform and has supported the inclusion of the G4 as permanent members. So has the UK and France in particular has supported an expansion of the UNSC on the permanent seats and non-permanent seats. Russia's stance is interesting because Russia has, especially following the Ukraine crisis, has favored a very representative Security Council. So Russia has categorically stated that new members to the Security Council have to come from a group of developing countries from Africa, Latin America, and Asia. And so Russia is okay with India and Brazil having permanent seats in the Security Council, but is not okay with Germany and Japan having the same because it already sees the Security Council having too much Western influence on it. So as far as Russia is concerned, that is the stance it's going to. Russia has stated on the record that it advocates for a pattern of the UNSC reform that takes into account a majority of countries and would ideally like to see the UNSC reform shaped into a way that the Western influence on the UNSC and the UNGA at the same time be diluted to a significant extent. China, on the other hand, has been and a lot of other countries, including India, have been pinpointing China for dragging its feet on the UNSC reform for the last 10 years, and particularly when it comes to the G4 countries. And because China's stance on the UNSC reform has been that the UNSC reform needs to be undertaken with keeping the medium and small-sized countries into account. And the G4 countries in particular do not take into account any country from Africa. And so
your point well taken. So whether Maham, do you think that is there any move regarding the reforms that whether to curtail or to end the veto power as well, and never ever facilitate those G4 countries who are aspiring for particularly this permanent membership and with veto power? So do you think that because this veto power has most of the times we have seen that hampered the Security Council overall working, and we have seen that it has not even implemented its own resolutions on Kashmir, Palestine, even on Ukraine, and lots of other issues. So do you think that there is any chance to have curtailed this veto or not to have veto in future?
So the UFC proposal in itself has spoken about the veto and has given a couple of recommendations on how, on the options it is open to discussing with regards to curtailing the veto. For instance, talks about curtailing the veto in mass human rights violations like war crimes, genocide, and mass atrocities. It also talks about curtailing the veto in by a vote of the General Assembly. And it also talks about curtailing the vetoes and limiting the veto to situations of specific chapters of the United Nations Charter. But the veto curtailment proposals have also come in from other groups, because as we spoke in the beginning, there were 8 groups. So a number of groups have spoken about how the UN General Assembly should a majority of that should be able to overrule a veto in certain situations, and that certain mass atrocities should
Maham,
now
your point
the
well taken. Your point well taken, Mr. Ambassador, and to you, Dr. Noor, that very brief, because we have run short of time. There are almost or more than 15 years that we are in intergovernmental negotiations for these particular reforms. So do you think that this process is going to end anytime soon, and we will have some sort of fruitful reforms into the UN Security Council? And we see that it has not only gained its lost reputation, but also to have its decision making must have to be implemented on ground.
That would not be easy. It's a huge challenge. There's so many different conflicting interests at play. We'll see how they play out in the coming years. But you know, when you have so many compromises, then it becomes difficult to enact genuine reform. And that is my fear, that because there's so many different positions, different perceptions, and when you have to come up with some sort of, you know, like unified sort of agreement in the end, that would require so much compromises.
Obviously.
That reform may not be the biggest gainer.
Obviously. Dr. Noor?
I would say that it will require a lot of negotiations and diplomacy to balance the interest. Balancing of interest is the key, if they can do through diplomacy.
Your point well
Yeah.
taken. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much, Dr. Noor. Thank you very much for your presence. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. And thank you very much, Maham, for being online and having very comprehensive and elaborative views. Thank you so nice of you. Viewers, as you have listened to our panelists, it is important that these negotiations must end with the fruitful results which we all want to have UN Security Council to be more effective in its decision making and more democratic, more inclusive, and having the regional representation when it comes to the reforms. And intergovernmental negotiations are a bit slow. That must have to take a pace in that perspective as well. It must have to be more result oriented and more functional in its perspective. So United Nations Security Council is a very important organ of United Nations if we want to have real-time, long-term, sustainable peace and security across the globe. So that needs to be more rational and more democratic. There is no doubt about it. This is all from today's Foresight. It's time to sign off. Allah Hafiz.